Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof.Jeffrey Sachs Fan World, and here is today's content. When I look at this new peace plan being placed before President Volodymyr Zelensky, I see far more than a diplomatic proposal. I see a profound test of leadership under extreme constraint, a moment where political symbolism, military realities, and geopolitical pressure converge into a single agonizing choice. Every wartime leader eventually reaches such a crossroads where the question is not what is ideal, but what is survivable. For Zelensky, this is that moment. Let me begin with what is new about this peace plan. It reflects a shift, not necessarily an abandonment of Western thinking. The early phases of the war were guided by maximalist aims, full territorial restoration, comprehensive military defeat of Russia, rapid NATO integration. But 2.5 years of conflict have reshaped expectations. Ukraine's counteroffensives have stalled, ammunition stocks are strained, the West faces political fatigue and elections of its own. The battlefield is settling into entrenched lines that are difficult to break without catastrophic cost. Thus, the plan now on the table revolves around a different logic-managed containment rather than outright victory. The plan imagines a ceasefire or freeze along current lines, phased sanctions relief tied to verifiable conditions, long-term security guarantees without immediate NATO membership, and a reconstruction program tethered to governance reforms. It is not the fulfillment of Ukraine's dreams, nor the satisfaction of Russia's ambitions. It is an imperfect framework born of exhaustion, realism, and the hard limits of power. This is precisely why it tests Zelensky personally. He built his moral authority on resistance, on the promise that Ukraine would never yield an inch of its sovereign land. His wartime speeches broadcast around the world have framed the war as an existential struggle for civilization, democracy, and dignity. To accept a plan that freezes Russian occupation risks being portrayed by opponents at home and critics abroad as capitulation. Ultimately, the question before Zelensky is not whether peace is desirable, of course it is, but whether he can navigate the treacherous terrain where peace, politics, and power intersect. This new plan forces him to confront the hardest truth of wartime leadership, that choices made in the name of national survival are often morally painful, politically risky, and historically necessary. When I examine Zelensky's current dilemma, I see a leader caught between the shifting political winds of Washington and the uncompromising expectations of his own society. This is not merely a diplomatic tension, it is a structural fracture in Ukraine's war strategy. From the very beginning, Ukraine's capacity to resist Russia has depended on an implicit bargain with the United States. Key fights Washington sustains, but now that bargain is under strain, strained by U.S. domestic politics, by the limits of Western military stockpiles, and by diverging visions of what victory means. Let me begin with Washington. The American political system is no longer unified behind Ukraine. In Congress, war fatigue has become unmistakable. Questions about corruption, governance, and accountability have resurfaced. Critics argue that Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition. Others insist that endless aid without a clear endgame is strategically reckless. For Zelensky, this represents a direct threat. Without American funding, artillery shells, air defense systems, and intelligence support, Ukraine's military position becomes dangerously fragile. Yet the relationship is complicated. Zelensky believes, rightly, that Ukraine's survival is tied to American leadership. At the same time, he feels deeply betrayed by the mixed signals coming from Washington. On one hand, the U.S. promises solidarity as long as it takes. On the other, it pressures Ukraine to adjust goals, reframe expectations, and consider compromises that contradict the promises of total liberation made during the war's early months. This is why Zelensky must engage in what I call strategic reconciliation. He must speak frankly with Washington without appearing subservient. He must accept the geopolitical reality that the United States is recalibrating, not abandoning its support. And he must convince American lawmakers that a stable, sovereign Ukraine serves the long-term interests of global security and European stability. To do this effectively, Zelensky must shift the narrative from victory at all costs to stability, containment, and long-term resilience. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the tension may be even more severe. Ukrainian society is exhausted, grieving, and fiercely patriotic. Many Ukrainians see any discussion of territorial compromise as betrayal. Zelensky cannot simply parrot the preferences of Washington. He must maintain legitimacy at home, where expectations of total liberation remain deeply tied to national identity and wartime sacrifice. The trauma of occupation makes compromise emotionally unthinkable for many citizens. Thus, Zelensky walks a razor's edge. If he bends too far to American pressure, he risks domestic revolt, political, social, or even military dissent. If he defies Washington too firmly, he risks a catastrophic loss of support. This is the brutal geometry of dependency. Ukraine cannot choose between Washington and Kyiv. It must hold both together simultaneously. From my vantage point, Zelensky's most important task is to restore strategic clarity in the U.S.-Ukraine partnership. He must articulate achievable military objectives, identify the reforms Washington demands, and reframe the war not as an all-or-nothing crusade, but as a long-term struggle in which political endurance matters as much as battlefield advances. Ultimately, the question is not whether Zelensky can repair the alliance. It is whether he can transform it into a more mature, sustainable partnership, one that balances Ukraine's sovereignty with the geopolitical constraints imposed by its most powerful patron. When I turn to the military dimension of Zelensky's dilemma, I see a stark and uncomfortable truth. Ukraine's ability to conduct decisive offensive operations has been deeply eroded, not because of a lack of courage or resolve. Ukrainians have shown extraordinary resilience, but because of structural constraints that no amount of bravery can overcome. The battlefield now reflects an asymmetry of resources, manpower, and industrial capacity that Ukraine cannot reverse on its own. Let me begin with the most important factor, the limits of a new counteroffensive. Ukraine's 2023 offensive demonstrated the enormous difficulty of breaching layered Russian defenses. Minefields, trench networks, drone surveillance, and artillery dominance all favor the defender. Russia has adapted its strategy and mobilized its industry. Ukraine, by contrast, cannot generate unlimited manpower, cannot produce weapons at scale, and remains dependent on Western stockpiles that are not infinite. Every new assault risks heavy casualties for minimal territorial gain. Given these constraints, talk of a fresh, sweeping counteroffensive is more symbolic than realistic. Zelensky understands this, his generals understand it, Western analysts understand it. Yet Ukraine must still project determination militarily and psychologically to maintain leverage at the negotiating table. This creates a paradox. Ukraine must appear capable of offensive action even when the material basis for such action is diminishing. This is precisely where the new peace plan becomes strategically relevant. Zelensky can reinterpret negotiations not as surrender, but as operational breathing space, a chance to regroup, retrain, and modernize Ukraine's forces without the constant drain of offensive attrition. Peace talks, even if inconclusive, can provide political cover for Ukraine to shift toward a more sustainable defensive posture while still receiving Western support. For the United States and Europe, the military objective has already shifted. early in the war, Western aid aimed to enable Ukrainian breakthroughs. Today, aid is calibrated to prevent collapse, maintain deterrence, and stabilize front lines. This is the quiet truth behind the diplomatic pressure. Western leaders know that dramatic battlefield advances are unlikely. They want Ukraine to hold its ground, not to pursue ambitions that could deplete its remaining strength. Yet, Zelensky is in an impossible position. If he reduces offensive aspirations, he risks appearing weak or defeatist. If he continues to push for breakthroughs, he risks losing precious manpower and weakening Ukraine's long-term resilience. This is a form of strategic entrapment. Any decision carries profound costs. From a long-term systems perspective, my own lens as an economist and geopolitical analyst, Ukraine's military future depends less on short-term offensives and more on building a robust, modernized, NATO interoperable deterrent. This requires high-precision defensive weapons, distributed air defense systems, secure digital infrastructure, a restructured command and control system, hardened energy grids, mobilization, reforms. Negotiations can either accelerate or impede these transformations. If handled skillfully, they can create political space for Ukraine to consolidate strength. If mishandled, they can demoralize soldiers, fracture alliances, and embolden Russia. In the end, Zelensky must navigate a military landscape where action and restraint are equally perilous. His challenge is not merely to plan operations, but to redefine what military success means when total victory is no longer feasible and long-term survival depends on avoiding catastrophic losses. When I shift my focus to Europe, I see another dimension of Zelensky's dilemma, one less discussed publicly but deeply consequential for Ukraine's future. There is a growing idea quietly circulating in Kyiv and championed by some European capitals that Ukraine might pivot toward Europe as its primary strategic anchor, especially if the United States becomes less reliable. On the surface, the logic is appealing. Europe is geographically closer, economically intertwined with Ukraine, and ideologically aligned around democratic principles. But beneath this idealistic frame lies a complex and sobering reality. Let me begin with the allure of Europe. For many Ukrainians, Europe is not just a partner, it is an identity, a civilizational aspiration. EU integration promises institutional stability, economic reconstruction, and long-term security. Europe offers public sympathy, humanitarian support, and a genuine moral commitment to Ukraine's sovereign choice. It is understandable why some in Kyiv believe Europe could become a more dependable patron than a politically divided United States. Yet, this aspiration collides quickly with structural limits. Europe does not and cannot replace the United States as Ukraine's primary security guarantor. The European Union is an economic union, not a military alliance. Its defense capabilities remain fragmented, underfunded, and politically contested. While frontline states like Poland, the Baltic countries, and the Nordics see Russia as an existential threat, Western European states remain cautious, reluctant to escalate tensions or commit irreversible military resources. This divergence is crucial. If Zelensky were to choose Europe over America, he would be choosing a partner that can sustain Ukraine economically but not militarily. Europe can rebuild cities, reform institutions, and anchor Ukraine in a stable political order, but it cannot deter Russia alone. Washington's military industrial base, intelligence capabilities, and strategic deterrent are still irreplaceable, yet Europe is not irrelevant, far from it. In fact, Ukraine's economic survival and political evolution are far more closely tied to Europe than to the United States. EU funds integration processes and regulatory harmonization offer Ukraine a long-term developmental path that no other partner can match. Europe understands that a collapsed Ukraine would destabilize the entire continent. This is why Brussels is preparing multi-decade reconstruction packages and candidate state reforms. So Zelensky faces a delicate balancing act. He cannot abandon the United States. The security risks would be catastrophic. But he cannot rely solely on Washington either. American support is subject to domestic electoral cycles and political polarization. Europe, by contrast, offers continuity but not overwhelming strength. This leaves Zelensky with only one viable strategy: a dual anchor approach binding Europe more deeply to Ukraine's economic future, while keeping the United States engaged enough to deter further Russian aggression. This is not a matter of choosing one patron over another. It is a matter of weaving both into a coherent framework that sustains Ukraine's independence. From a broader philosophical perspective, this speaks to the limits of geopolitical agency for medium-sized states in a fragmented world. Ukraine cannot dictate the strategic preferences of the great powers, but it can shape its own alignment through careful diplomacy, structural reforms, and long-term planning. Europe will play a decisive role in Ukraine's future, but only in concert with, not in place of, the United States. Zelensky's challenge is to make Europe a pillar of resilience without allowing it to become a substitute for hard security. And that requires a level of strategic sophistication few leaders are ever forced to develop under fire. When I turn to Moscow's perspective, it becomes immediately clear that the new peace plan is interpreted not simply as diplomacy, but as a verdict on Western endurance. Russia reads the international system with cold precision. Every hesitation in Washington, every political division in Europe, every logistical bottleneck in Ukraine's military supply chain, these are for the Kremlin confirmations that time is on Russia's side. And so this new peace initiative is understood in Moscow as something far deeper than a negotiation framework. It is seen as proof that the West is nearing its limit. From Russia's vantage point, the peace plan signals that Washington and Brussels are recalibrating. Sanctions fatigue has spread through Europe. Congressional resistance in the United States has grown stronger. Ukraine's battlefield momentum has slowed. Russia has mobilized its economy, expanded its defense industrial base, and fortified its positions. As Putin sees it, the structural balance is shifting in his favor, not dramatically perhaps, but steadily. This shapes Russia's interpretation of Zelensky's dilemma. If Ukraine embraces the peace plan too eagerly, Russia will interpret this as verification of its own strategy that sustained military pressure can force Kyiv and the West to accept a de facto partition. Moscow will then push for maximal concessions, a demilitarized zone limitation on Ukraine's long-term force development, restrictions on Western weapon deployments, an implicit or explicit halt to NATO integration. Russia will claim these demands are necessary for security, but they are, in truth, instruments for limiting Ukraine's sovereignty. However, if Zelensky rejects negotiations outright, Moscow will adopt a different strategy. It will conclude that Ukraine is overextended and that the West is losing patience. In this case, Russia will simply wait, betting that political fragmentation in the United States, economic pressure in Europe, and Ukrainian battlefield exhaustion will eventually break the coalition. This long war strategy does not require dramatic advances. It requires only sustained attrition. This is precisely the trap Zelensky faces. Any posture he adopts can be misread by Moscow. Too much openness invites exploitation. Too much resistance invites escalation. This is the brutal logic of asymmetric conflict. The only way for Zelensky to maintain leverage is to combine conditional openness with credible resilience. He must signal that Ukraine is willing to explore diplomatic pathways, but only under arrangements that do not institutionalize Russian occupation or strip Ukraine of its long-term security architecture. At the same time, Ukraine must demonstrate that it remains capable, not necessarily of sweeping offensives, but of solid, sustainable defense. Russia responds not to rhetoric, but to capabilities and cohesion. If Ukraine can show that its alliances hold, that its economy can survive with Western support, and that it can impose meaningful costs on any renewed Russian advance, then Moscow will view compromise as a rational exit. But if Ukraine appears isolated or internally fractured, Russia will demand more and concede less. From my perspective, this is where true leadership lies. When I analyze Ukraine's economic situation at this stage of the war, I see a country that is fighting on two fronts simultaneously, the military front against Russia and the economic front against collapse. The new peace plan, for all its ambiguities, directly intersects with this second battlefield. In many ways, Ukraine's economic survival is now the central determinant of its strategic choices. No nation can sustain a prolonged war, support millions of displaced citizens, rebuild devastated infrastructure, and modernize its armed forces without a functioning economic base. That base, in Ukraine's case, is now dangerously eroded. Let me begin with the fundamentals. Ukraine's economy shrank dramatically in the first year of war. Industrial capacity destroyed agricultural output, disrupted millions of workers, displaced energy, infrastructure targeted. Even today, much of Ukraine's fiscal capacity depends on external financing. Tax revenue is insufficient, local budgets are strained, and private investment has largely fled. Many young and skilled workers are abroad, creating long-term demographic and economic challenges. Ukraine is not simply fighting a war. It is trying to prevent the structural hollowing out of its society. In this context, the peace plan is more than a political framework. It is an economic lifeline. Whether Kyiv likes it or not, international donors, investors, and institutions will tie reconstruction to political stabilization. European governments want assurances that their vast financial commitments will not be consumed by a war with no end. American lawmakers want accountability and clarity. Private sector actors will not rebuild factories or supply chains while missiles are falling on Ukrainian cities. Thus, any path toward reconstruction must be coupled with some form of de-escalation or managed stability. But Zelensky faces a difficult balancing act. If he embraces the economic opportunities of the peace plan too enthusiastically, critics will accuse him of trading sovereignty for money. If he rejects it entirely, Ukraine may lose access to the very funds needed to rebuild schools, hospitals, energy systems, and transport networks. In geopolitical terms, a country without an economic future has no strategic leverage. Its choices narrow, its population suffers, and its diplomacy weakens. What Zelensky can and should do is reframing. Instead of presenting negotiations as a concession, he can present them as a gateway to long-term European integration and economic renewal. A sustainable reconstruction program led by the EU, supported by the US, and backed by international financial institutions could transform Ukraine into a modernized, export-oriented economy aligned with European standards. This would require anti-corruption reforms, digital governance, energy diversification, and defense industrial cooperation. These steps are not wartime concessions, they are peacetime imperatives. There is also an important strategic insight here. Economic reconstruction is itself a deterrent. A Ukraine that is prosperous, integrated into EU markets, and supported by credible Western financing becomes much harder for Russia to coerce or destabilize. Prosperity is not merely economic, it is geopolitical. From my own perspective, Ukraine's real long-term victory will not be measured only in territorial lines, but in whether it emerges from this war as a functional, forward-looking state rather than a permanent frontier. Reconstruction is not a post-war luxury. It is part of the war effort itself. It strengthens Ukraine's cohesion, anchors its alliances, and shapes the conditions under which any future negotiation will occur. For Zelensky, the task is to use the peace plan not as a surrender to reality, but as a tool to build the economic foundations of sovereignty, to transform war weariness into reconstruction momentum, and to ensure that Ukraine's future, determined not by the ruins of the past, but by the institutions it builds moving forward. As I step back from the complicated web of pressures facing President Zelensky, military limits, Western fatigue, economic collapse, and a shifting geopolitical environment, I am struck by the profound ethical weight of the decisions he now confronts. This new peace plan is not simply a diplomatic option. It is a mirror reflecting the harsh reality of Ukraine's position in the international system. It forces Zelensky to confront the deepest question any wartime leader must face. How do you protect your nation when all available choices carry enormous cost? Let me say something clearly. Peace under duress is morally excruciating. It demands that a leader consider outcomes that are imperfect, unpopular, and emotionally wrenching. And yet, and this is the ethical paradox, continuing a war without a viable path to victory is equally fraught. It risks lives, infrastructure, social cohesion, and the long-term viability of the state. The tragedy of leadership in moments like this is that there are no clean choices, no heroic scripts, only competing forms of harm, and the responsibility to choose the least devastating path. What worries me most is that Zelensky now navigates a geopolitical landscape where the incentives of Ukraine, the United States, and Europe are diverging. Washington wants an end game. Europe wants stability. Ukraine wants liberation. Russia wants time. Each of these actors uses the peace plan as a different instrument, strategic, political, or psychological. Zelensky alone among them must think not of geopolitics, but of the daily survival and long-term dignity of his people. This is why I argue that Zelensky's deepest challenge is not military or diplomatic, it is philosophical. He must redefine what victory means in conditions where maximalist goals are no longer achievable. Victory cannot simply mean reclaiming every inch of land. It must mean preserving the sovereignty, viability, and democratic future of Ukraine. A frozen conflict, if paired with strong economic reconstruction and credible long-term security guarantees, may in fact be a more humane path than a war fought to exhaustion with diminishing returns. I am fully aware that such a stance is emotionally unsatisfying. Nations want justice, citizens want liberation, soldiers want purpose, leaders want legacy, but statesmanship requires a different kind of courage, the courage to choose the path that preserves life, even when it contradicts the rhetoric of wartime resolve. In practical terms, this means Ukraine must pursue a triangular equilibrium, a strategy that binds Europe, economically retains essential American security support, and uses negotiations to prevent further loss rather than legitimize Russian gains. Zelensky must anchor Ukraine's future not in the uncertain promise of total military victory, but in the concrete possibility of long-term reconstruction, EU integration, and the gradual strengthening of Ukraine as a durable democratic state. There is also a deeper truth here. The international system must evolve. It cannot continue treating medium-sized states like Ukraine as battlegrounds for great power competition. A sustainable peace requires a new architecture, one that respects sovereignty, reduces escalation incentives, and provides real pathways for reconstruction and reintegration. Without such an architecture, Ukraine will remain trapped in a cycle of war dependency and geopolitical vulnerability. So as I look at Zelensky's options, I see neither surrender nor triumph. I see the courage required to navigate a morally imperfect world. I see a leader forced to choose not between good and evil, but between competing necessities. And I see above all the possibility that Ukraine's future may depend not on dramatic battlefield reversals, but on the quiet, disciplined work of rebuilding a state strong enough to shape its fate long after the war ends. That to me is the true test of Zelensky's leadership and the true promise of a just peace